Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We don't have a little Words with Prof segment because
Why?
words are unimportant. It's because they are important. The language that we use, as a great man once said, words are the currency of politics.
And that great man happens to be sitting right across from me at Dan Proft.
That's correct. Very good. A greater man, Emerson, first the language is corrupted, then man is corrupted. And isn't that what's happened over the course of our little experiment in representative republicanism, small r? This brings us to a book, The Lost History of Liberalism. The author, Helena Rosenblatt, is the executive officer of the PhD program in history at the Graduate Center at CCNY, or at CUNY, I should say, City University of New York, specializing in 18th and 19th century European intellectual history. And she joins us now for a discussion of liberalism, that word, in addition to its various applications to various philosophies. Helena Rosenblatt, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. And so you trace the history of the word liberalism because it's been applied by everyone or to the likes of, John Locke to Milton Friedman to Nancy Pelosi. So there's a lot of ideological distance between those three names. And it's one of the reasons we say leftism here, not liberalism, because it can be so misunderstood depending on its application.
Yes, that's right. When I started this project, one of the reasons I began to write this history of liberalism and to do the research is that I noticed these contradictions, and in a way that people were talking past each other in the way they use the word liberal. I mean, what you mentioned is absolutely correct, and then you have the problem of it meaning one thing in America and another thing in most of the rest of the world. I was just in Europe, and of course there in sort of colloquial parlance, liberalism means small governments and freer markets, whereas in America, colloquially, it means big government. So I was curious about, why that happened, and my history is much about that, tracing the use of the word across the centuries.
And did the French Revolution give birth to liberalism?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I argue, and that's kind of a controversial thing to say, but it's the truth. If you look at liberalism and the word was coined in around 1810, 1812, and that's when the first theorists started talking about liberalism as such. I mean, so another thing I show, of course, somebody like John Locke, who's often considered a founder of liberalism, never considered himself a liberal and never spoke of liberalism. So what I argue is that to avoid anachronism and to get sort of on the same page about what liberalism means, we should again track the history of the use of the word, and that it shows that it was the French Revolution really that gave rise to liberalism.
Well,
and the first theorists of liberalism were not John Locke. They were Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël and those in their circle.
Maybe that was an opportune time to try and distinguish between Jacobinism and liberalism in the sense of like peaceful pluralism.
Absolutely. I mean, liberals were moderates or centrists, really. They wanted to distinguish themselves from Jacobins on the one side and those who wanted to continue the terror, for example, which was a very radical phase of the revolution, and they also saw their adversaries as on the right as well, very much so. Of course, the counter-revolutionaries, those who wanted to go back to the old regime. So they were moderates. They were fighting for things like constitutional government, civil equality, and a number of rights of the individual, among which freedom of expression, by the way, freedom of the press was enormously important, even more, I would say, than freedom of property, the right to property, which I think has been exaggerated.
And what you're describing and why the left adopted it, I would argue the sort of the modern day Jacobins adopted liberal, is because there's this historical connection to virtuous things, freedom-oriented things.
Well, yes, but today there's the people who consider themselves the classical liberals, the true liberals, are really libertarians.
Right.
So there's this debate or sort of a battle over who's using the word correctly. I've been engaged in some debates that have been very interesting with a libertarian, and he thinks that they should reappropriate the word, that these left wingers are using it incorrectly.
Well, the progressives, what word should they use then? Progressive?
Well, they've been shying away from the word liberal since, for some time. I mean, you remember Ronald Reagan with his L word. Many now are using the word progressive. I personally don't see why why they have to be worried about the word. They should just have the courage of their convictions. The history of liberalism is something we should be proud of. In fact, whether you're on the right today or on the left, most people will agree, wherever they are on the spectrum, that liberal democracy is a good thing. And that's what liberals fought for, really, was a liberal form of democracy.
You make an interesting observation in your book about liberalism as it relates to religion. For liberalism, religion became good because of its usefulness for politics and not because of its truth. Liberalism instrumentalized religion, subverting it to higher political purposes. So this, to me, turns out to be super, super important in terms of beginning the explanation of the politicization of everything and the elevation of the state as the national religion.
Interesting that you should say that. I agree with part of what you say. I mean, liberalism had a conflictual relationship with established churches, I would say, from the very beginning, in particular the Catholic Church, since we're talking at first about France, right? So liberals were upset, frankly, about the collusion of the Catholic Church with the absolute monarchy, which went back centuries. So they did attack the Catholic Church and the power of the church, and many of the key theorists in early liberalism and throughout the 19th century were in fact Protestants. But I don't think it's correct to say that they were against religion. I mean, they thought of themselves as reformers of religion more than atheists or even deists. I mean, this is what their enemies, their adversaries said again and again and again, and it's happening again today. If you look at various Catholic writers and other, not just Catholics, but Orthodox Protestants who consider liberalism a kind of individualism that has gone haywire and that is dissolving all social bonds and promoting a kind of atheism. I think that's unfair and incorrect. Now, the issue of wait. Let me just hold you there if I can. Yeah. So I'm not saying the theorists that you were talking about were anti-religion. I'm saying it sort of set us on a path to what you just described, this atomized secular society, and you're suggesting that what some of those social critics coming from a religious perspective are saying about that the secularized atomistic society in which we live today is not correct? I would say that liberalism plays a role, but so does industrialization, the economy. I don't know if you want to place all the blame, if you want to talk that way, on an ideology, a way of thinking about politics that also promoted religious freedom, which many thought was a good thing and was going. Even some Catholic. Look at Tocqueville, for example. He has no problem with separation of church and state.
No, sure.
He's going to be good for Catholicism. And I also want to say that not all Catholics were illiberal or were adversaries. Of course not. Catholicism doesn't speak with one voice. But I think that there are many dissolving factors in society, if we want to talk about that are not due to liberalism. So I would say I'm a defender of liberalism in that sense.
Well, I'm a defender of classical liberalism generally, but I mean the bastardization of it, as has been the case with so many words and so many ideas. I mean, track the philosophical development and ubiquitous application of the word to the growth of the state over the last 200 years, even over the last 70 years. In addition to that, what's happening on the ground now, just in terms of critics coming from a religious perspective, let me give you a case study. California Assemblyman plans to argue for a resolution that tells religious leaders in California what they should preach from the pulpits. So that's not particularly consistent with classical liberalism, at least with respect to some of the philosophers you mentioned.
Oh no, you're absolutely right. That sounds like going absolutely against what liberals have stood for a very long time. Certainly, a separation of church and state has been a core liberal principle. But you can't expect all liberals to agree on everything. That's another thing that I write about in my book. That there have been these internal debates from the very beginning about issues. So this is not new today, and it has sort of weakened liberalism in a sense at times when they couldn't agree on certain policies. But generally, the notion that liberalism creates in some way because of its attitude to religion, because it favors freedom of religion and separation of church-state, that should create or be responsible for the state becoming more powerful. This is actually an old argument that Catholic Christians said. And then it got translated into some kind of blaming liberalism for totalitarianism in the 20th century. But basically, there's been these polemics, and liberalism has been painted with a broad brush, and these differences haven't been recognized. I think the majority of liberals throughout the centuries would be horrified by what that person just said that you quoted.
No, I agree, but I'm just saying that what is being done under the name of liberalism is not anything that resembles classical liberalism, and that's purposeful. I mean, that the people, politicians, demagogues understand the power of words and the meaning that words carry. So they use mellifluous words that sound very pleasant and freedom-oriented, and they use it to do all sorts of things that are the antithesis of freedom-oriented policies. We see it on college campuses. We see it in corporate boardrooms. We see it on social media, and we see it in the posture of state legislatures and politicians towards houses of worship and religious leaders. That's my point.
No, yeah, I completely agree with you, and particularly, what you say which is so important about the power of words. Words are weapons in a way; they're tools, and they have a certain power in themselves. And a liberal has been one of those words. Liberalism, certainly. How about socialism, which right now is people are very frightened of and distancing themselves from, and I find that incredibly interesting. This has not been the case all the time in the history of liberalism. There has been periods when it has been perfectly okay to call yourself a social liberal or a socialist liberal. Even somebody like Winston Churchill said that he favored something called a social liberalism. And by that, he didn't mean, command economy and no free markets. He didn't mean expropriation of private property. Absolutely not. He meant he spoke about the cause of the left out millions, the poor, right, helping them to actually be able to participate in the market, whereas they were too poor really to have a fighting chance. So that's more what social and socialism has meant, and it continues to mean that, by the way, in parts of Europe, which I just I said I visited. So they're not shying away for a certain use of the word socialism when it's associated with liberalism.
She is Helena Rosenblatt. She's the executive officer of the PhD program in history at the Graduate Center